Hi, we are with Nikki Lefebvre, who is the Executive Director of the Natick Historical Society, and Terry Evans, who is
I serve on the board.
serves on the board, okay, of the Historical Society. We want to start with Nikki. So tell us when Natick was first settled and when was it incorporated?
Sure. So Natick today is on the ancestral homelands of Nipmuc peoples, and who lived here for many, many generations before Natick was established as a praying town or a mission community in 1651. The town wasn't incorporated until over a century later in the 1780s. It's unusual in that there's a large gap between its establishment as that praying town and to its being incorporated as a full town in the state of Massachusetts. From 1651 up through the 1680s, this was a community of entirely indigenous residents, okay. And the first English family didn't arrive until the 1680s. Okay. And even then trickled in slowly until in the 1800s, the land governance system shifted from one in which land was held in common by indigenous families who lived here to one in which individual lots were parceled out. And increasingly after that happened, after about 1720, English and later American bought up those individual plots. By the 19th century, there are more factories in the community, and in particular in the shoe industry. It really takes hold in the 1830s here in Natick and then matures over the course of that century.
It's one of the things that is fascinating to me that the earliest Board of Selectmen in Natick was all indigenous. The highway surveyor was indigenous. And that's really the important thing to understand is up until 1719, when land was divided and then could be sold off. It was almost exclusively, with just a few specific exceptions, kind of governed, managed, and lived in by Native people. There are still indigenous people, including Natick Nipmuc, living here.
The river made this place right here in South Natick one of great spiritual meeting, but also sustenance. And so this is really the kernel, this area of Natick's sort of blossoming, frankly, before 1651 when the town was established, but also afterwards. And the center of Natick becomes more densely populated and more politically important later on, not because of the river, but because of the railroad.
In around 1810, what we now know today as Route 9, running east and west across Massachusetts, was the Boston and Worcester Turnpike. That was the path that was laid out from where Brookline meets Boston all the way out to Worcester. And that it was a private venture. They collected tolls, and one of the things they didn't want was any competition. So in the late 1820s, early 1830s, when noise was being made about this newfangled thing called a railroad, they wanted it nowhere near what was then the Worcester Turnpike. And so they ended up siting it about 1.5 miles, 2 miles south, where it runs today, and it's now the Boston and Albany. The same happened in Natick and in Framingham, which is the center of town and the center of industry and the center of kind of what thrived, moved with it. For the shoe industry, what it meant was that it suddenly opened up national markets. So this little kind of carpet, the 10-footers that they individually made shoes in, suddenly blossomed into factories because they could do mass production and meet mass markets around the country.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Now, how long were the shoe industries here? And what happened with that?
That's a great question. So it begins as a cottage industry in the early 19th century, really blossoms in the late 19th century with larger factories, no longer cottage 10-footers in people's backyards with single artisans, making their shoes. Larger factories by the end of the century. And into the 20th century, there's still significant shoe production in Natick.
Did you go anywhere near the baseball factory? Anybody point
Yes.
out Okay,
Yes.
So across the street from the baseball factory was a block-long, 4-story shoe factory called Pratt and Reed, and they cranked out hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes a year.
Wow.
And there was the railroad right next door to it. But it was a significant part, along with Lynn and Brockton. It was one of the leading shoe kind of manufacturing facilities until you started seeing markets and manufacturing shift elsewhere. And then Natick became known as a flower town.
There were lots of nurseries and greenhouses in Natick in the middle of the 20th century.
I think of Natick more as a bedroom community for Boston, where a lot of people commute into Boston. Is that right or no?
It was a town before it was a suburb, and I think that's what's really important in its identity. We've had two great fires in Natick. One in South Natick in 1872 that I will say destroyed the nascent collections of the Natick Historical Society. And then one in January of 1874, right in the heart of Main Street. And it burned everything for several blocks, north and south, and also some of Washington Street that adjoins it.
Wow.
What you saw was the whole center then rebuilt at the same time, and so we have still remaining the distinction of having the only main street in eastern Massachusetts that is substantially Victorian in architecture, because the fire gutted everything and everything got built back at the same time.
Built right after that fire.
Yeah.
Do they know how the fire was caused, or?
It started in a shoe factory. But you know, today I think a lot of people who aren't so familiar with Natick, when they hear about it, they think of the mall and they think of retail, right? As if Natick only exists right along Route 9. And you know, that's a shame, because Natick Center is just a thriving community of culture and arts, and there are so many cool things going on down in Natick Center that I feel like there's this renaissance of vibrance downtown. You know, that's really exciting, and so much bigger and more meaningful than the retail along Route 9, although that has a great history too, which I don't want to discount.
There was a famous baseball factory here as well. What do you know about that?
There is still the building of the baseball factory, the first baseball factory in the United States, and therefore the world, because nobody else was playing baseball at the time, established in the 1850s by Harrison Harwood. And you know, he purchased the patent from two young men who were shoemakers who were playing ball in Natick. And I just love this story, because when you think about baseballs, you don't automatically think about shoes. But if you pause for a minute, right, like a leather shoe is the act of sort of curving leather and stitching it together, which is exactly what you do when you make a baseball. And so these two young men came up with a better way of making the ball. At the time, baseballs were not standardized. They looked different depending on where you played and who you played with. Harrison Harwood saw the genius in their invention. He purchased the idea from them, and he started cranking out baseballs. And that baseball, the figure-8 pattern with the stitches, has not changed since then.
What else of significance in Natick's history would stand out? Maybe famous people who lived here, or you said George Washington actually passed through?
He did on his, kind of serendipitously, on his way back from his first visit. He's inaugurated as president in April, and he decides he has to go out and meet the people. So, very familiar with Boston. He had been here many times during the Revolution, so he decided to start with Boston. And he came up along largely what we know today as Route 20, and he stayed in Boston for 5 days. Because of bad weather that prevented him going back via the Hudson River Valley, he came down what we know today as Route 16. And so in November of that year, he came past, and there are buildings all along the route he passed, not just in Natick, but in other towns, that stand today and would have borne witness to his passing.
Wow, that's really cool.
In a more contemporary sense, we have Henry Wilson, who was Ulysses Grant's vice president, who served, and actually who died in office, who's considered kind of a favorite son in a way. And I was talking briefly about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is associated with Natick, not because she lived here, but because she had the wisdom to marry a man from Natick, Calvin Stowe. She'd made her fame in 1852 with Uncle Tom's Cabin. She would come and visit her husband's family, and she would hear these stories of these characters who really lived and made Natick what it is. And she wrote a book in 1869 called Old Town Folks that was modeled on these real personalities. Of the praying towns that were established by Reverend John Eliot, it is the one that retains its indigenous name. That Magunko has been absorbed into Hopkinton and Ashland, Neshoba's been absorbed into Concord, but Natick is Natick. And it is believed that the term is in Nipmuc, translated as my land.
Dottie Green, who played in the women's national baseball leagues, during the Second World War, and went to Natick High School and turned out to be this incredible athlete when it came to playing baseball, and set a lot of records. And the film with which we're all familiar, A League of Their Own, which features Dottie of the Rockford Peaches, follows this woman's stories very closely. The society was founded in 1870. And at the time, there were two, a clothier and a minister, both of whom had a passion for collecting natural history as well as cultural historical documents. And they kind of came together and they founded the society, and they had rooms up above the clothier's shop across the street from where we are today. Their first rooms burned down, as we mentioned, but then when a man named Oliver Bacon included in his will the provision for both the library, the Bacon Free Library that is upstairs in this building, as well as the Historical Society, this structure was erected and opened in 1880 and has provided ever since the home of the Natick Historical Society, which was at the time called the Historical Natural History and Library Society of Natick. So we've been here since 1880. In 1948, along with the promotion of a movie called Mr. Belding Builds His Dream House, which was all about this couple that was in Manhattan and outgrew their space and they wanted to build their house out in the suburbs or the country. But when they promoted that film, they built dream houses, I want to say 5 or 6 of them throughout the country, and one of them is in Natick. And it still stands in Natick today, although its form has changed a bit over the years, but it was a model house with brand new GE appliances. GE funded it. Myrna Loy, who starred in the movie, she came to the opening of that house and she put her high heel print in the driveway.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. You just scratched the surface.
We'll have to leave it at that. Everybody else has to come here and find out for themselves the rest.
Yes, please come.
Thank you.